Del L. Morris's fingers were already around the enforcer's wrist before she'd set down her beer. She hadn't stood up yet. That was the part they would remember later, that she hadn't even stood up. The four men turned slowly, the way men turn when they aren't sure what they're seeing, but are certain it can't be a problem. She was black, late 20s, red dress, tattoos running the full length of both arms like a language written on skin.
Seated. Come.
Beer still sweating in her other hand, looking at them the way you look at whether you've already decided not to let ruin your evening. Touch him again. Not loudly. Not urgently. The way you say something when the outcome is already decided, and the words are just a courtesy. The biggest one laughed first. That was a mistake. He stepped toward her and she stood up, and what happened in the next 30 seconds happened the way serious things happen, without theatrics, without wasted motion, with the quiet efficiency of someone who learned a long time ago that the performance of danger was for people who weren't actually dangerous. 3 men hit the wet pavement of the Mapogu street market. The fourth had his hand moving toward his waistband. Dell's pistol was already out. You really want to finish that thought? He didn't. Del L. Morris had pulled her jacket tighter stepping off the subway at Mapogu an hour earlier, the rain already making decisions about her hair that she hadn't been consulted on. The street market ahead was alive the way it always was on Friday nights. Vendors calling out over the hiss of griddles, smoke curling into wet air, strings of yellow light trembling above the pavement like they were thinking about giving up. She wasn't here for the food. She was here because this particular corner of Seoul was one of the few places in the city that didn't require her to explain herself. She'd found the bar 8 weeks after arriving from Lagos. Small place. No English on the menu, an owner who had looked at her first like a problem and then like a regular and now like furniture, which was precisely what she wanted. She ordered her usual, found her usual seat, the one with the unobstructed sight line to the street. Let the noise of the market settle around her like something she'd earned. Seoul had been good to her. Better than Lagos. Better, in certain ways that mattered, than the years she'd spent in transit between cities that were never quite hers. She had something here, a reputation in circles that didn't advertise themselves, a carefully maintained distance from people who asked the kind of questions that were really demands in disguise. She had learned very early, in a house in Lagos that smelled of palm oil and low-frequency grief, that the safest version of herself was the one no one could read. She was halfway through her second beer when she noticed the 4 men. Then she noticed who they had. Shirley Han had a driver. He also had a security detail that rotated on 6-hour shifts, a personal assistant who monitored his calendar in 15-minute blocks, and a penthouse in Gangnam with a view that made visiting dignitaries go quiet mid-sentence. He had left all of it behind at 7:15. His driver, a man named Park who had worked for him long enough to understand which evenings required no questions, had watched the car door close and said nothing. There were nights when Shirley Han needed to disappear. Not into another secured boardroom or another restaurant with a private entrance and a chef who knew his preferences, but downward, into the kind of neighborhood where nobody recognized him, and the beer came warm, and the man at the counter next to him was worried about rent, not return on equity. He would sit for an hour, sometimes 2,
And breathe.
and remember. He had grown up in a 2-room apartment in Non. His mother had worked double shifts at a textile plant on the south side and come home smelling of machinery and determination. His father had left before Shirley was old enough to have a properly formed memory of him, which his mother had always explained with a particular silence that meant do not ask again. He had not asked again. He remembered being 16, sitting at the kitchen table under a lamp that flickered in the wind, eating instant ramen at midnight, and telling himself, not with anger, not with the hot and brittle energy of resentment, but with a quiet and absolute certainty that felt more like fact than ambition, this is not the ceiling. It wasn't. But the boy who had made that promise still lived somewhere in the architecture of the man in the expensive suit. And that boy needed, occasionally, to be returned to be reminded that the climb had been real, that the hunger had been real, that the people still living inside that hunger were real, and not simply a number in a social impact report. So Shirley came to neighborhoods like Mapogu. He sat at counters. He ordered whatever was cheapest. He listened to conversations that had nothing to do with him. And for 1 hour, he felt like a person rather than a portfolio. Tonight he stayed longer than usual. He noticed them when he stepped out into the rain. For men, positioned wrong, the kind of stillness that is not stillness at all but readiness, wearing stillness as a costume. He had just enough time to form the thought, this is a mistake, before two of them had his arms and all four were moving him toward the alley with the practiced quiet of people for whom this was not a first occasion. Shirley Han, underboss of the Jung Network, a man whose name caused problems to rearrange themselves and rooms to recalibrate, had nothing.
No detail.
No leverage. No driver waiting at the curb. Just himself in the rain in a neighborhood he had come to because he wanted to feel ordinary. He was learning, in the worst possible way, that ordinary had its own exposure. Then, from somewhere behind him, a voice. Touch him again. What she had not stopped doing was watching. Exits. Faces. Hands. The small involuntary movements people made when they believed no one was paying attention. That habit had saved her life more than once before she turned 20. Her uncle Remy took her in because there was no one else. He was her mother's younger brother. Loud, generous, possessed of a laugh that took up more room than it was supposed to, and the kind of man whose phone rang at hours when phones had no business ringing. Dell understood what he was before she had the formal vocabulary for it. She understood it the way children understand things they are not supposed to, completely, and in silence. He never hid it from her exactly. He simply lived around her and let her draw her own conclusions, which she did, quietly and accurately. He taught her other things. How to read a room before you'd cross the threshold. How to stand so that people reconsidered whatever they'd been about to do. How to move without announcing yourself. He taught her the way some uncles teach card games, casually between other conversations, as though the lessons were not lessons at all. She was 15 when his enemies ran out of patience with him. Her Aunt Loretta arrived from London 10 days after the burial, packed Dell's things without asking, and said only, "Your mother would never forgive me if I left you here." That was the end of Lagos. London was gray in a way no one had prepared her for. Not cold exactly, but withheld, like a city that had decided not to commit to you. She was a translation of herself there, accurate but slightly off-register. The streets found her anyway, the way streets always find the ones who already speak their language. By the time she moved on, she had built a reputation in circles that didn't advertise themselves and a personal rule she had never once broken. Don't stay long enough to become necessary to anyone. Seoul had been a deliberate choice. Large enough to disappear into. Structured enough to build something real inside. She had arrived with 2 bags, a contact name on a piece of paper, and the particular self-sufficiency of a woman who had been her own safety net for so long she had stopped noticing the drop beneath her. She was not looking for anything the night she walked into the bar in Mapogu. She was not running from anything either. She was simply a woman sitting alone, reading a street she already knew how to read. The number called at 10:14 the following morning. Dell was on her second coffee, standing at her kitchen window, watching the street below. She let it ring 4 times before she picked up. Not because she hadn't expected it. She had, with the same quiet certainty she expected most things, but because she wanted a moment to decide how she felt about that. "You were gone before I could say anything that mattered," he said. No introduction. No preamble. As though they were already mid-conversation, which in a way they were. "You said thank you." That was sufficient.
A pause.
"Then, I'd like to say more than that. Properly, if you're willing." She almost said no. The refusal was already shaped and ready, the kind she'd delivered so many times it came out smooth. She had a system, carefully maintained, road-tested, that kept people like Shirley Hahn at precisely the distance where their gratitude was still manageable and their interest had not yet become a complication. The system had never failed her. She told him she would think about it, which was, for her, as close to yes as she permitted herself before noon. His office was on the 34th floor of a building in Udo that made a quiet and irrefutable argument for itself against the Seoul skyline. The receptionist greeted her with a warmth calibrated precisely to signal that her appointment had been flagged. Dell noted the calibration. She noted most things. Shirley was standing when she walked in, not performing it, just already on his feet, moving away from the window as though he'd been thinking rather than waiting. He turned, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He noticed her beauty the way you notice the weather, immediately, involuntarily, as a condition of the environment that simply had to be accounted for. The red dress was gone. Today, dark trousers, fitted black jacket, hair down. She moved through the doorway the way she moved through every space, as though she had already assessed it before entering and found nothing that concerned her. He gestured toward the chairs. She chose the one with the clearest line to the door. He noticed that. They spoke for 40 minutes. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers, not the restless, performative listening of someone composing their next sentence, but real attention, unhurried and specific. She answered carefully, offering just enough, watching him the way she watched everyone, looking for the angle buried inside the courtesy. It didn't come. What came instead was a conversation that moved without effort from the previous night to the neighborhood to why he went there, and she found herself answering that question with more honesty than she had planned. He laughed once, genuinely caught off guard by something she said, and she felt something shift almost imperceptibly in her chest, like a door moving slightly in a breeze that had no business being there. She did not acknowledge it, but she noted it. And later, crossing back through the lobby into a sharp Seoul afternoon, she registered, with a faint, precise alarm, that somewhere around the 20-minute mark, she had stopped checking for the exit. That had never happened before. The offer came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks later, over lunch at a restaurant he had selected specifically because it had no private room and no one would mistake it for theater. He slid a folder across the table. She opened it without touching her water first. "This isn't charity," he said, before she could say it for him. "I have 17 divisions and people in every one of them who are technically capable. I have almost no one who walks into a room and sees what's actually happening underneath what's being performed. That's not a personality. That's a skill. It's the specific skill I've needed for 2 years." She read the full folder before she responded. He let her, which was itself a kind of answer. The salary was serious. The title was real. The terms contained no clause that would make her his in the way that powerful men sometimes wrote clauses that meant exactly that. She accepted on Wednesday, with conditions of her own, which he agreed to without negotiating. What she could not account for, walking out of that building into an afternoon that felt inexplicably unlike the morning that had preceded it, was the sensation that had settled quietly in the center of her chest. Not happiness exactly. Something steadier than that. Something that felt, with a precision that unsettled her, like safety, arriving from a direction she had never thought to defend. The Jung Network's Central Operations Building did not advertise itself. 30 floors, reinforced everything, a lobby that looked ordinary and functioned as anything but. Dell moved through it in her first weeks the way she moved through everything new, quietly, observantly, touching nothing she wasn't certain of yet. Her role spanned 3 operational divisions. Special assessment, which was the formal language for what Shirley actually wanted, A second set of eyes with no investment in how things had always been done and no incentive to protect the people currently doing them. She was good at it, better than she'd expected, which told her that the instincts Shirley had identified were more broadly applicable than she'd assumed. A syndicate operations floor and a Lagos street corner were not, at their core, different environments. Both rewarded the same thing, the ability to see what was actually happening underneath what was being performed. And something underneath the performance of the Jung network's internal structure was not right. She found the first thread in her third week, buried inside a logistics summary for one of the network's legitimate infrastructure holdings. A payment correctly filed, correctly approved, correct in every visible respect, except that the vendor's registration number, traced back 2 levels through a chain of subsidiary contractors, resolved to a shell company incorporated 11 months before the Jung contract began. Not impossible, but the timing had a quality she recognized. The quality of something arranged rather than something that happened. She closed the file, opened another. The second thread was thinner. A pattern in the operational expense approvals from the previous 2 years. Small amounts, individually beneath the threshold of scrutiny. But laid against each other, they formed a shape. Consistent intervals. Consistent authorization. Always the same signature.
Tay.
Shirley's right hand. 17-year lieutenant. The man whose name came up in every room as the one who had been there from the beginning and never wavered. Dell sat with that for a long moment. She had met him twice since joining the network.
Polished.
Precise. The kind of man whose warmth arrived exactly on schedule and never ran 1 degree warmer than necessary. He had welcomed her with a smile that reached his eyes because he had rehearsed it until it did. She had registered the rehearsal immediately, filed it without comment, and waited. She pulled 3 more years of records. By the time she closed her laptop, the operations floor was empty and the cleaning crew was moving through the corridor outside. She had not proven anything yet. What she had was the thing she trusted more than most people trusted: evidence, the feeling of a pattern that knew it was being observed and had been carefully taught to look like nothing at all. She had learned early that an accusation was a weapon that shattered in your hand if drawn before it was ready. She would wait. She would build. She would make certain that when she finally spoke, there would be nothing left to argue with. Tay had survived 17 years inside the Jung network by being, above all else, readable. Not transparent. Readable. The distinction was everything. Transparent men had nothing to hide. Readable men curated precisely what you found when you looked. He had built something inside Shirley's blind spot. Careful, long, and enormously profitable. A relationship with the Book faction, conducted in increments small enough to remain invisible, each transaction insulated from the last. Safe house coordinates sold as operational efficiency updates. Shipment routes rerouted through Book-controlled corridors at margins that couldn't be questioned without access he controlled. 3 Jung soldiers had died in ambushes that could only have been constructed from the inside. Shirley had grieved them. Tay had stood at the memorial and said the right things and felt nothing except the practiced sensation of saying the right things. He first noticed Dell at the end of her 4th week during a division briefing she had no formal standing to attend and had attended anyway. She said almost nothing for the full hour. Asked one question near the end, something about authorization timelines that was, on its surface, entirely reasonable. Tay had answered it. And then, walking back through the corridor afterward, replaying the question, he had stopped walking. Because the question was not about authorization timelines. The question, assembled correctly, was about him. He stood in the corridor for a moment with that understanding. Then, he straightened his jacket and began to think about how to make Del Morris a problem that resolved itself before she became a problem he had to explain. He had no way of knowing, not yet, that she had already anticipated exactly that. and had already begun preparing for it. The city knew surely Han the way it knew certain weather by the way people moved when it was coming. Restaurants cleared their best tables without being asked. Conversations adjusted their volume within 3 seconds of his arrival. Men who ran their own operations and answered to no one found reasons to be elsewhere when he was scheduled to be somewhere. This was not performed deference. It was the involuntary recalibration of people who understood, at a level beneath language, that they were in the proximity of something that did not require their cooperation to proceed. He had not built this. He had simply become it, the way water becomes the shape of what contains it, gradually, completely, without announcing the transition. The private reality was quieter and considerably less impressive. He slept 4 hours on good nights. He ate whatever was closest when he remembered to eat. He had a penthouse in Gangnam with a view that visiting men described as extraordinary and that he had stopped seeing 2 years after moving in. He had associates who would die for him. He knew this with the same clinical certainty he knew most things, and not one person he would call at 2 in the morning for a reason that wasn't operational. He had learned to call this self-sufficiency. It was easier than the alternative name. 3 of his soldiers were dead. Kong, 26, who had a younger sister in Busan, he sent money to every month without being asked. Park Do, 31, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who remembered everyone's coffee order. Lee Sung, who had just turned 24 and had come to Shirley 2 years ago with nothing but hunger and the right instincts, and who had been dead for 11 days. All 3 had died in ambushes. Clean, positioned, no forensic generosity left behind. The kind of ambush that required knowing exactly where the target would be, at what time, moving through which corridor. The kind of ambush that was not intelligence gathered, it was intelligence given. Someone inside the Jung network was feeding information to the Book faction. Shirley had known this for 6 weeks. The knowing had not produced a name. It had produced instead a particular kind of sleeplessness, not the restless kind, but the still kind, where you lie in the dark and reconstruct every conversation and every briefing and every room and ask yourself which face you have been reading wrong and for how long. He had said nothing to Tae. He had said nothing to anyone. He had spent 6 weeks watching and arriving at nothing he could use. And then a woman in a red dress had dismantled 4 of the Book faction's extraction crew in 30 seconds in a Mapoga street market, picked up her beer, and told him he was blocking her view. He thought about her for 3 days before he made the call. Not because he was uncertain, because a man in his position did not reach toward something useful without first understanding exactly what it was going to cost him. Lagos taught Del Morris the same lesson it taught everyone who paid attention, that the world had a texture underneath its surface, and learning to feel that texture was the difference between people things happened to and people who saw things coming. Her father had been the first teacher. Emeka Morris was not a violent man. He was something more useful than that. He was a man who understood rooms, who walked into a space and within 60 seconds had identified every current running beneath the conversation, every alliance, every grievance wearing a smile. He had made his living this way, negotiating between people who needed things from each other but would never say so directly, translating the distance between what men wanted and what they were willing to admit they wanted into outcomes that paid well and left no one feeling defeated. He had not intended to teach Del any of this. He simply lived in front of her, and she watched with the particular attention of a child who understands that observation is a form of protection. By the time she was 10, she could tell when a room had shifted before anyone in it had moved. By 12, she could walk into a space and know within moments who held the actual authority, regardless of who was speaking. Her father noticed, said nothing about it directly, simply began, occasionally, to ask her afterward, "What did you see?" and then listened to her answer with the full attention he gave things he considered worth his time. That was how she learned that being seen by the right person in the right way was not exposure. It was education. Then he left. No funeral, no finality. Just a Thursday morning when he was there, and a Thursday evening when he wasn't, and a mother who answered the question once with a silence that closed the subject permanently. Dell had put the grief somewhere practical, kept the lessons, sharpened them against every new city, every new circumstance, until what had started as a child's instinct for self-preservation became something considerably more precise. London first, then Amsterdam for 14 months. A year in Nairobi that had clarified several things about herself she'd been avoiding. Each city a version of the same experiment. How long before someone needed something from her she hadn't agreed to give? Never long. She had developed the rule somewhere between Amsterdam and Nairobi, formalized it by the time she reached Seoul. Don't stay long enough to become load-bearing in someone else's life. It wasn't coldness. She had examined it honestly enough to know that. It was architecture, the deliberate design of a life that could not be structurally compromised by the removal of another person. It had worked. For years, in city after city, it had worked without exception. She had not yet accounted for a man who didn't ask her for anything, who collected the details of her life without making her feel catalogued, who remembered how she took her coffee. He found her on a Wednesday, which told her he had been looking since Monday. Different market, different district, Mangwon this time, an open-air produce section she had chosen specifically because it had no logical connection to Mapogu and no reason to appear in any pattern a person might construct around her movements. She was examining persimmons with a focused attention of someone who had no interest in being found when she became aware of him standing 2 stalls down, not looking at her, waiting with the particular stillness of a man who had decided that patience was the correct instrument for this specific situation. She did not look up immediately. She finished her assessment of the persimmons, selected 2, paid for them, and turned. He looked different in daylight. Still composed, still wearing something that cost more than most people's monthly rent, but without the rain and the blood and the 4 men on the ground. He was simply a man standing in a Wednesday market holding a paper cup of coffee he hadn't touched, watching her with an expression that was impossible to read and clearly intended to be. She found that mildly interesting. "You found me," she said. Not a question, not an accusation, simply an acknowledgement of the fact and everything it implied. "I have resources," he said. "I use them." That's either reassuring or concerning. I haven't decided which. He almost smiled. "I have a proposition. Professional. The terms are yours to set." She looked at him for a moment, the full, unhurried assessment she gave things she was considering seriously, then gestured toward a bench at the edge of the market with a clear sight line in 4 directions. He followed her to it and waited until she sat before he did, which she noted without commenting on. He explained it without ornamentation. Someone inside the Jung network was feeding operational intelligence to a rival faction. 3 men were dead because of it. His internal people had 6 weeks of nothing to show for their effort. He needed someone with no existing loyalties inside the organization, no incentive to protect the current architecture, and the specific ability to see what was happening underneath what was being performed. He had watched her dismantle 4 professionals in 30 seconds while holding a beer. He needed her to dismantle something more complicated. "Name a figure," he said. She named 1. A number she had calibrated specifically to be unreasonable, high enough to end the conversation cleanly without requiring either of them to pretend there had been genuine negotiation. He said fine without pausing. Not "I'll consider it." Not that steep. Just fine, with the flat certainty of someone closing a door that was never actually open for debate. Dell looked at him. He looked back. She made a mental note, clear, immediate, filed under "Do not repeat this error," that she should have named a higher number. She told him she would start Thursday. She spent her first week saying almost nothing. This was not passivity. It was methodology, the same approach she had used in every new environment since Lagos, refined over years and cities until it had become less a strategy than a reflex. You did not learn a room by entering it loudly. You learned it by becoming temporarily invisible inside it and watching what people did when they believed the watching had stopped. The Jung Network's inner circle operated across 3 floors of a building that presented itself to the outside world as a logistics consultancy and functioned, internally, with the structured hierarchy of an institution that had been running long enough to develop its own culture, its own unspoken protocols, its own particular grammar of loyalty and rank. Dell moved through it with her usual economy. Present at the briefings she was cleared for, quiet in the corridors, asking questions that were individually reasonable and collectively a map she was building of every relationship in the room. She read them the way her father had taught her. Not their words, their adjustments. The micro-recalibrations people made when someone entered a space, the way a conversation shifted register depending on who had just sat down, who deferred to whom in the moments before the formal meeting began when people believed the actual meeting hadn't started yet. Those were the real briefings. Dell attended all of them. The lieutenants sorted themselves quickly. 2 were genuinely competent and privately exhausted. 1 was ambitious in the particular way of someone who had been overlooked long enough to become dangerous about it. 2 more were loyal in the uncomplicated way of men who had been with Shirley since the early years and had organized their entire sense of self around that continuity. And then there was Tay. He registered on the 2nd day. Not because he did anything wrong, that was precisely the problem. He did everything exactly right, with a consistency so complete it had the quality of a performance that had been running long enough that the performer had forgotten it was a performance. His warmth arrived on schedule. His deference to Shirley was calibrated to the millimeter, present enough to signal loyalty, restrained enough to avoid the appearance of theater. He asked the right questions in briefings. He laughed at the right moments. He said the right things about the 3 dead soldiers with an expression of grief that was technically flawless. Dell had spent her entire life learning to tell the difference between a feeling and a rehearsed feeling. The difference was almost always invisible. Almost. She watched him for 4 days before she was certain. His loyalty was not a thing he possessed. It was a thing he maintained like a garden, deliberately, with ongoing effort in a way that genuine loyalty never required because genuine loyalty did not need tending. It simply existed. Dell noted it, said nothing, filed it in the part of her mind reserved for things that were going to matter later. Then she went looking for proof. Tay moved carefully, which she had expected. What she had not expected was how quickly he moved. By the end of her 5th week, he had already begun, not visibly, not in any way that could be named cleanly in a room, but in the way that experienced men operated when they wanted something to happen without fingerprints. A comment here, positioned as concern. A question there, framed as diligence. Nothing that announced itself as a campaign. Everything that functioned as one. She knew because she had ears in the right places and because she understood from long practice that the most reliable signal that you were close to something was when the something started moving away from you. The version of Dell that Tay was quietly constructing for Shirley's consideration was recognizable enough to be credible and distorted enough to be useful. A woman with an unclear history in cities that didn't leave paper trails. Connections in Lagos that raised questions a thorough man ought to ask. An angle that hadn't revealed itself yet, which was, he suggested with measured restraint, precisely the kind of angle that warranted attention. He was not accusatory. Accusation was a blunt instrument, and Tay was not a blunt man. He was concerned. He was thorough. He was simply doing what a loyal lieutenant did, which was think carefully about the people his principal had introduced into the inner circle without the usual process of verification. It was, Dell thought when the shape of it reached her, genuinely well constructed. She did not react. This required more discipline than it might have appeared. There was a version of her, the younger version, the one who had learned in harder rooms than this, that the first person to show you they'd been watching you held a specific kind of leverage, that wanted to walk into whatever conversation Tay was currently having and make clear that the surveillance had been mutual and had started considerably earlier than he understood. That version of her was satisfying to imagine and completely useless to deploy. She let him continue. Adjusted nothing visible about her behavior. Attended the same briefings, asked the same calibrated questions, maintained the same unhurried presence that she understood by now was itself unsettling to him, because a woman who was genuinely threatened behaved differently than this, and her failure to behave differently was a data point he couldn't quite place. She opened a second file on her personal system. Not for the financial irregularities. That file was already 3 weeks deep and growing. This one was for Tay specifically. Every comment she'd heard reported back. Every meeting he'd requested with Shirley in the 10 days since she'd clocked him. Every small repositioning of the narrative around her presence inside the network. She documented it without anger, without urgency, with the same methodical patience she brought to everything that mattered. She had learned early that the most dangerous response to a man who is building a case against you is to quietly build a better one. She built it backwards. That was how her father had taught her to find the shape of a thing that didn't want to be found, not forward from motive, which was where most people started, and where most people got lost inside their own assumptions, but backward from consequence. Start with what happened. Work toward why. Let the facts arrange themselves rather than arranging them toward a conclusion you'd already decided on. Kong had died on a Tuesday in the Songdong district. A 4-man interception at a safe house whose location had been shared in a logistical debrief 6 days prior. Dell pulled the debrief record. Cross-referenced the attendance. Noted the authorization signature on the location clearance. Park Do had died on a Thursday, 3 weeks later. Different district, different operation, same outcome. A clean ambush at a transfer point that required advanced knowledge of a route that had been changed 48 hours before the operation specifically to reduce exposure. Dell found the internal communication that confirmed the route change. Found the distribution list. Found whose name appeared on it, and no one else's. Lee Sung had died 11 days before Dell arrived at the Zhong network. His operation had been verbal, no written record of the briefing, which was itself a protocol deviation that should have generated a flag and hadn't. Dell spent 2 days reconstructing the meeting from secondary sources. Scheduling records. A car log. A single line in a building access report that placed one person in the operations room during the window when Lee Sung's assignment would have been discussed. The same person. Every time. The only person present at the specific moment when each operation's critical variable, location, route, timing, moved from classified to compromised.
Tay.
She sat with the completed reconstruction for one full evening before she did anything with it. Not because she doubted it. The pattern was not circumstantial. It was structural, the kind of convergence that didn't happen accidentally 3 consecutive times, but because she understood what bringing it to Shirley would cost him. And she found, with a clarity that surprised her, that she cared about that cost in a way that was no longer strictly professional. She told him on a Thursday evening, in his office after the building had mostly emptied. She laid the documentation on the desk without preamble and let him read it in the order she had assembled it. Kong first, then Park Do, then Lee Sung, because the sequence mattered. She wanted him to arrive at Tay's name the same way she had, through accumulation, through the undeniable weight of a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for longer than either of them wanted to calculate. He read everything, without speaking. When he finished, he was quiet for a long time. Not the processing quiet of a man considering his response. The deeper quiet of a man absorbing something that had rearranged the architecture of 17 years in the span of 8 pages. He didn't look at the documents when he finally spoke. He looked at her. How long have you known? Certain? Tonight. Suspicious? Since the second week. Another silence. Longer than the first. Why didn't you? Because suspicion without proof is just noise, she said. You needed something you couldn't argue with. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not gratitude, exactly. Something less comfortable than gratitude, and considerably more significant. She picked up her bag. He said her name, not a question, not a request, just her name, the way you say something when you need a moment to exist before the next thing arrives. She stopped. Waited.
Thank you, he said.
The same words as the market. Entirely different weight. She left without answering. Walked the full length of the corridor to the elevator and stood inside it while the doors closed and acknowledged, finally and without flinching, that this had stopped being a job somewhere around the second week. Possibly earlier. They found her on a Saturday morning, which told her Tay had moved faster than she'd anticipated and was more frightened than he'd let show. She was walking back from the Mangwon market, the same one where Shirley had found her 3 weeks ago, a detail she registered with grim appreciation for the symmetry, when she felt the shift in the street behind her. Not a sound exactly. A change in the texture of the morning, the way foot traffic adjusted around two people who were moving with a purpose that didn't match the rhythm of a Saturday. She had been feeling that texture since she was 10 years old. She did not break stride. She turned into a side street she had identified 2 weeks prior for exactly this category of situation. Narrower. One entrance. A recessed delivery alcove, 12 meters, in that offered angles the street didn't. She had not known she would need it this soon. She had known she would need it. The first man was professional enough to be dangerous, and not quite professional enough to account for someone who had already decided where the confrontation was going to happen before he'd finished deciding to have it. She heard him commit to the approach and moved first, compact, economical, the way her uncle had taught her when she was 15, and the lessons had not felt like lessons. He went down hard against the alcove wall and did not get up, but he was breathing, which was the outcome she had aimed for. The second man was faster. He caught her forearm before she'd fully reset, and for 3 seconds it was genuinely close. Then it wasn't. She dislocated his shoulder with a rotation that was almost mechanical in its precision, guided him to the ground with the remainder of the momentum, and stepped back. She stood in the alcove breathing steadily while the sounds of the Saturday market continued undisturbed around the corner. 2 men on the ground. One would walk home. One would need a ride and a hospital and a story he would have to construct carefully. She called Shirley before she had consciously decided to. That was the part that stayed with her, not the 2 men, not Tay's escalation, not the fact that she was standing in a service alcove in Mangwon at 9 in the morning having just confirmed that someone inside the network had issued a kill order with her name on it. All of that was manageable. All of that was simply the next thing to be handled. What was not manageable was that her hand had gone to her phone and found his number before she'd run any of the usual calculations. Before she'd assessed what to report and how and when. He was simply the first person she wanted to tell. She hated that with a clarity that was almost admirable. He picked up on the second ring. 2 of Tay's men found me in Mangwon, she said. They won't be reporting back usefully. A silence. Short and very dense. Are you hurt? Not where are you? Not I'll send people. Not the operational response of a man managing an asset. Are you hurt? She closed her eyes briefly.
No, she said.
Stay where you are. I don't need. Delaware. Just her name. The same way as the office. The same weight. Stay where you are. She stayed. She told herself the bag was a habit. That was true enough to be useful and incomplete enough to be a lie. It was 4 in the morning, and she was on the roof of her building with her 2 packed bags and the Seoul skyline doing what it always did, existing at a scale that made personal decisions feel both urgent and meaningless simultaneously. The city didn't care. It never had. That had always been one of the things she liked about it. She had not decided to leave. She had simply packed, the way she always packed when something significant concluded, because packing was the physical grammar of her life, and she had been speaking it for so long that her hands performed it without consulting her. Every city she had ever left, she had left like this: bags ready, options open, the door not yet closed but the route already mapped. The difference was that she had been standing on this roof for 40 minutes, and she had not moved toward the door. She heard him before she saw him. Unhurried footsteps on the stairwell access. No attempt at silence, which was its own kind of courtesy, announcing himself so that she could choose, in the seconds before he arrived, what she wanted this to be. He came through the rooftop door and stopped when he saw the bags. Looked at them for a moment. Looked at her. Said nothing about them. He came to stand beside her at the ledge, close enough that she was aware of him as a physical presence, and far enough that nothing was assumed. They looked at the city together in silence for a while, the way people look at things that are too large to address directly. "You don't have to report to anyone," he said eventually. "Whatever comes next, that's not why I'm here." "I know why you're here."
Do you?
She was quiet for a moment. Below them, Seoul moved in its 4 a.m. register, sparse headlights, the distant infrastructure of a city that never fully stopped. "What are you afraid of?" he said. Not with the softness of someone handling something fragile. With the directness of someone who had decided that the careful approach had a cost he was no longer willing to pay. She could have deflected. She had deflected this question in various forms from various people in various cities for the better part of 15 years. The mechanisms were well maintained and immediately available. She didn't use them. Becoming something someone can subtract, she said. Being necessary to a person, and then watching that become the thing they use. He took that in without rushing it. "I have not asked you for anything you didn't agree to give," he said. "I don't intend to start. I know that." "Then what are we actually discussing?"
She looked at him then.
Really looked, the way she looked at things she was finally done being careful about. "I stopped checking the exits," she said. "With you. I noticed it the first week, and I kept waiting for it to feel like a mistake." "Did it?"
"No," she said.
"That's the part that frightened me." He didn't move toward her. Didn't reach for her. Simply stood in the 4 a.m. dark and let the truth she had just handed him exist between them without doing anything to manage it. That was the thing about him that had, from the beginning, been impossible to defend against. He didn't need to possess things to value them.
He simply made space for them.
She had never once known what to do with that, and standing here she understood. She was done pretending she didn't want to learn. She looked at the bags. Then she left them where they were. Not because she had nowhere to go. She had 3 cities and enough contacts that she could disappear before sunrise and rebuild inside a month. She had done it before. She would have been fine. She stayed because she didn't want to go. Because the city below her contained something she had not had in any of the other cities, in any of the careful architectures she had built and maintained, and eventually dismantled. Something she did not have a clean word for yet. She thought her father would have recognized it immediately. She thought he would have told her in the quiet way he told her things that mattered, that it was all right to stop building exits into everything. That some rooms were worth staying in.